Blood circulates through the body in a system of blood vessels pumped by the heart, and this entire system is referred to as the cardiovascular system. So cardio means heart, and vascular means vessels. So this term literally describes the heart and vessels of this particular system. Blood vessels are categorized by size and direction of blood flow. So starting with vessels that go away from the heart are arteries, which are the largest vessels that carry blood away from the heart. So a student of mine told me a really handy way of remembering this the other day, which is A for artery equals A for away from the heart. Now, arteries, the largest vessels, then branch into smaller vessels called arterioles. So you can kind of think of this as highways going off into smaller roads. Arterioles then branch off into capillaries, which are the smallest blood vessels of all. Capillaries then empty into venules, which are returning to the heart. And venules are comparative to arterioles in size. The venules then unite with veins, which are similar to arteries in size, except for they're returning to the heart. So this diagram illustrates this vessel system. So if this is the heart up here, you have blood, oxygen-rich blood, leaving the heart into arteries, the largest of the vessels, which then branch off into arterioles, which are more numerous but also smaller in diameter. The blood flowing through arterioles then branches off into smaller and more numerous capillaries. This blood then eventually, after going through the various systems in the body, is oxygen depleted and needs to return to the heart. It goes through capillaries into larger venules and then eventually back up into veins, which then return blood to the heart. The smallest of the vessels, the capillaries, is where the exchange of materials like glucose and gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. And it actually occurs into the fluid surrounding the capillaries, which is referred to as the interstitial fluid. So this diagram shows the major veins and arteries in the human body, and it's a lot of information to take in. So one of the best ways of digesting this information is to look at veins and arteries above the heart, then look at veins and arteries below the heart, and veins and arteries to the lungs. So breaking it up into those smaller categories makes life a little easier. So starting with the lungs, we know that pulmonary means related to the lungs. So the pulmonary arteries actually carry deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. And the pulmonary veins deliver the oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. So there's actually two pulmonary arteries and two pulmonary veins because you need a vein and an artery to go to each of your two lungs. Above the heart, you have the aorta, which carries oxygenated blood away from the heart, and the external carotid artery, which supplies most tissues of the head except for the brain and the orbit. And then returning from above the heart, you have the jugular vein, which receives blood draining from the brain, head and neck, and the superior vena cava, which receives blood from all areas above the diaphragm. There are also branchial arteries in each of your arms, which supply the anterior flexor muscles of the arm. Below the heart, you have the renal artery, which delivers blood to the kidneys, the abdominal aorta, which delivers blood to the lower extremities of your body, including the digestive tract and the pelvic organs, and the femoral artery, which delivers blood to thighs and the inner knee. Returning, you have the femoral vein, which carries blood away from the thigh and the inner knee, and the inferior vena cava, which actually returns blood to the heart from all regions below the diaphragm. We'll take a look at the structure of the vessels in the circulatory system, starting with veins and arteries, which share very similar features in their structure, such as they both have the same number of tissue layers, but they differ in the thickness of these tissue layers. So this is a vein on the left and an artery on the right. And starting on the very inside of the vein, there is a thin endothelium layer surrounded by an inner layer of connective tissue, which is then surrounded by smooth muscle and finally an outer connective tissue. Now, the artery has the same number and types of these layers, except arteries have a much thicker layer of smooth muscle. So you can see here that this smooth muscle in the artery is much thicker than it is in the vein. This is for a very good reason. The artery carries blood away from the heart and has to withstand very high pressure surges of blood from the heart, and that's exactly what the role of the smooth muscle is. It's to provide that strength and structure to the artery. So arterioles retain this smooth muscle layer, which is in veins and arteries, and in arterioles that smooth muscle layer helps to regulate blood pressure, which I'll talk about in more detail in another video. So now we'll take a look at capillaries in a little more detail. So capillaries only have a wall that consists of a single layer of endothelium tissue. So they're extremely thin and also extremely narrow. So you can see in this photo down here, this electron micrograph, the red blood cells in a capillary. And so the capillary itself is only the width of those blood cells traveling through the capillary. So they're very, very narrow and the walls are very, very thin. And the reason for that is that it enables capillaries to easily exchange materials with the interstitial fluid that surrounds those capillaries. So here's what that looks like in the tissue of your body. You would have an arteriole, which is branched off from an artery, carrying oxygenated blood. That then branches off into capillaries, which are surrounded by the interstitial fluid. And this is where the capillaries exchange things like nutrients and gases such as oxygen diffusing out of capillaries into cells, and then carbon dioxide, the waste product of cellular respiration, diffusing back into the capillaries. You also have nitrogenous waste crossing from the interstitial fluid into the capillary. And then finally, that oxygen poor blood, carrying waste products such as carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste, will transfer out through a venule and then eventually out into a vein. Veins receive blood at very low pressure. In fact, the smooth muscle layer in their walls is reduced or even absent because they don't need to have as much strength for the pressure of blood going through them like an artery does. In fact, a vein, unlike an artery, will actually collapse when it's empty. So if the pressure in veins is so low, how does blood get back to the heart against the force of gravity? Say, for example, from your leg back up to your heart again. On many veins, they have little flaps or valves called venous valves. And what they effectively do is keep blood flowing in a single direction. So here is the venous valve in your leg. And as the muscles in the leg contract, they squeeze the veins and propel blood through the open valves in a single direction. So you can see that in the right image here. As these muscles contract as you're moving the leg, it opens the venous valves, pumps the blood up the vein, and then that valve shuts again. And this is how blood moves against gravity.